Rather than going to center, your body plummets you below your window of tolerance, down to hypoarousal, which is like you're tired, you're numb, you're apathetic, you're sitting in some like comfy chair, drinking your adult beverage of choice, scrolling or watching Netflix or something, like you just shifted. And then you go to sleep and you get up the next morning and you shoot back above the line. And you leave and you plummet back below the line. If you don't do anything differently, if you don't intentionally make any shifts, it would take your body 18 hours to reset on its own, right? So what has to happen to get to the window of tolerance is you have to intentionally make this shift. You have to, if you're above the line, do something that soothes. That would be different for everybody in this room. That might be music, that might be talking with a friend, that might be going for a walk, might be mowing your lawn. Who knows what it is? That's your job to experiment with what helps your body soothe and come back to center and make that shift intentional. If you've already plummeted below the line, you need to energize. You need to connect your brain and your body again to have feelings and shift out of numb. That might be exercise, it might be dancing it out in the kitchen, whatever would bring your body back to center. But it has to be an intentional shift. You have to own this roller coaster yourself. And if you, I'm talking about, at the very ends of the day, this is something you can actually pay attention to over the course of the day. You can kind of say, am I like a 10 or a 1? Right? How do I get myself somewhere between a 4 and a 7? Do I need to walk around the block? Do I need to bring up pretty pictures on my phone of my loved ones? What do I need to do to help me shift? And that's the kind of continual adaptive recovery. The other thing I will say as we head into this talk about resilience is any self-care exists both at the individual level and at the systems level. So any conversation about mental health and trauma always brings up resilience. But I will get on my soapbox right now and say, resilience isn't just an individual issue, right? You can't just create systems and then tell people to be more resilient in them in order for them to do better, all right? Resilience is an emergency system. Resilience is your spare tire. How many of you have spare tires in your car? Everybody, I hope, right? If you have a car. Or now all they give you in 2024 are donuts, right? But you should have one. You should have one so that if you get a flat, you can get to help. But you shouldn't be driving around on the donut all the time, right? Resilience is what we have to rely on when we've dipped below, and that gets us back to a place where we can replenish. If we're driving on our donut all the time, we are at high risk for much bigger problems. And as I was thinking as I was taking the train in here this morning, if you're working in fields where trauma is ubiquitous, you probably need more than one spare tire. You are driving your Land Rover without roads. So one spare tire might not cut it. Right? Or you need a spare tire and a lot of patch kits or something. But you have to be able to know that that reserve needs to be attended to, but it's also just a reserve. So there are 3 forms of resilience. There's the resilience I carry inside me, and actually up until the late 70s, early 80s, that was all the research. The research was done on corporate kind of middle-aged white guys, and it was all about pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and resilience exists only inside me. And we do have resilience inside of us. Our temperament can be a source of resilience, our intelligence is a source of resilience, our history, our experience, all those things that live inside us, right? But once they started researching other groups of people, they found there were 2 other forms of resilience. There is the resilience that I have in my relationships that can make, people I can lean on, people, whether they're actual alive people, or they might be people from your history. Like I have a grandmother who was a social worker for the state of Maryland for 25 years, and she is just a source of strength, even though she is no longer here. And I lean on her words, right? And then there is the source of resilience that is being connected to something bigger than yourself. So my faith, my purpose, my values. When something gets hard, I might have a difficult conversation because, you know, it's my noble purpose that people have conversations around trauma. So I'm going to overcome my, you know, difficulty or anxiety and do it anyway. That's a source of resilience. So coming in from resilience, so first of all, I believe healing is possible. I've spent the last 20 years helping people do it in various configurations. It requires attention, and it follows a form. It's not magical. It's work. In some ways, it follows the same form as learning, only trauma requires a period of unlearning, because the protections and the ways in which we organize ourselves around trauma have to be unlearned so that we can kind of let them go. So I'm going to actually use this slide, because that red arrow, crisis, if you're helping people with trauma in a situation of crisis, so the pandemic was a good example of this, you don't start with healing, you start with stabilization. You get people sturdy. You make the workplace predictable. And you know what the routines are. You have meetings that are predictable. You know where the resources are. You help people feel as solid as they can. You get people with their feet underneath them first, before you actually get to working with the trauma. And then you go to the preparation stage, and the preparation stage is getting ready to do the healing. I liken healing from trauma to a high altitude climb. Like if you were gonna go up Everest, you're not just gonna fly to Kathmandu and start walking, right? It takes a year to prepare to go to Everest. And partly I liken it that way because actually at the top of Everest, you're doing what you know how to do. It's just walking, right? But it's walking in a really hard place. And so the conversations around trauma, even though they're just conversations, they're hard conversations. So you want people to have a little more support underneath them. So the preparation stage is, in some ways, looking at that resilience bucket. Like, what are my resources? How are our relationship so that I know we can trust each other in this conversation, right? And as a leader, your stance in crisis or stabilization is I can help support people feeling more solid. In preparation stage, your stance is I can help people connect to their resources and connect to each other. The next stage is unintegration. So you start to look at those protections and start to let them fall apart a little bit. So you know, if you're a control freak, you begin to let go of control a little bit. Or if you don't trust people or you don't lean on other people for help, you might ask for help. You start to let go of some of your protections. And in that, often, the story of trauma begins to come out. And in identification, you start to name and honor the aspects of trauma that people experienced. And then in integration, you begin to put those pieces together so that the narrative and the story becomes one whole. And when the narrative and the story become one whole, the past can become the past. So when I can say what happened, how I protected myself, and what didn't happen, if I can put all those pieces together and start to understand the impact of trauma on me and the impact of actually working on the trauma on me, it now is the thing in the past. And that's a really different experience. And then in consolidation, you can begin to rebuild your resilience and orient yourself back towards the present. And it's a cycle because you go through it as many times as you need. It isn't a one and done. So how do you have these conversations? There must be those among whom we can sit down and weep and still be counted as warriors. And I think that there's long been a myth that, if the trauma impacts you, somehow it's a flaw or a weakness. And if it doesn't impact you, you're doing fine. And I almost feel like I want to flip that on its head. The modern American workplace, whatever, in the post-war world of work, we came up with what leadership looked like. We came up with how people should be at work. But if you really think about the group of people that decided those rules, they were people who had returned from World War II. They were veterans who had lived through trauma and had decided that workplace could be one place where they actually didn't have to deal with the trauma. They could have no feelings there, and they could outsource their feelings to their wives at home, right? And we haven't really adapted to the idea that actually that isn't the experience of the people coming into the workplace in the last 20 years, and it never really served them to begin with. We feel before we think. That is the science of emotion. So if we want to use our whole selves, if we want to be emotionally intelligent, we have to have access to emotion. If we're shut down, we don't have access to it. So as I said, there's if we look at healing from trauma like on a high altitude climb, then I have been helping leaders find a base camp. Now, base camp on Everest is still 18,000 feet. It's a hard hike. But if you can establish a place where you know what's solid underneath you, and you can either do this at the individual level, I can create a base camp, or you can do this at the team level. We can create a base camp. And I recommend doing both if you have the ability or the kind of power and role to do that. And these are the questions, and you can do them, as you can see, individual and group. To have conversation of what are my strengths? What am I bringing to the party that I can lean on, right? If you know the strengths that you can lean on, then if you have to, I think of like rock climbers, you nail the piton in, and you've got this rope, and if you know what your strengths are, then you can swing over to something that's harder. But if you don't know what your strengths are, you can't lean on them, right? What are some of the routines that support me or support us? What are our check-in meetings? How do we know when we're going to come in contact? As an individual, do I have a routine that has me get grounded in some way, shape, or form, that's taking care of myself, mind, body, spirit? And then who is on our team? And by this team, I kind of mean the teams that the Tour de France guys have, where, they have a nutritionist and a massage therapist and a mechanic, and they have like 15 people looking after them to help them be at their best. And you should know who is on your team. Who is the person you call when you need somebody to tell it to you straight? Or who's the person you call when you just need somebody to make you feel better, right? Who are those people who are your people that help you in those moments? What are some practices or activities that ground us? So, for example, in some workplaces and teams I work with, taking one of the positive emotions and starting every meeting with them. Let's do a round of gratitude, something you're grateful for this morning. Or interest. What captured your interest this week? Letting people bring a different energy to the group, and also so you get to hear and see each other differently. And then lastly, how will we know, or how do I know it's time to return to base camp? What are my warning signs or signs of stress that say, I need to come back and return? And one of the questions that I think is really important for leaders to ask their people is, how will I know you need help? Like, what are your signs? Rather than it being, your assumptions or the filters you use to assume what help looks like. So I don't have a big ending. I'll stick the landing. I can. But I'm grateful for the work you do. It's been a year. I've talked to a number of different groups of journalists over the past year, and I have to say that I think I wake up in the morning and open the New York Times with a very different view of all the people whose job it was to make all of that happen and who are holding really difficult stories. And I really urge you to take as good of care of yourself. The world needs your work, and if you guys don't take good care of yourselves, people will leave the field. And if you don't take good care of your people, people will leave the field, right? So value the leadership work you do, and self-care isn't like a nice to have. This isn't Calgon take me away. This is like routine maintenance. I've said this before in other places, but I've worked with oil companies that took better care of their trucks than most organizations take care of their people, right? You are the asset. So really value and honor that. So thank you. I read something recently where they were comparing, is this like a 1 Kleenex trauma or a 12 Kleenex trauma? And there isn't an amount. I know that when I'm watching the news as well, right? That I know people experienced horrible traumas. And this is a put your oxygen mask on yourself so that you can help other people. Because you can imagine it's not affecting you because it's not as bad as the other, but that's not true. We're all breathing the same air, and it is impacting you, and it's impacting your longevity, and it's impacting your capacity to understand what you're listening to. Because over time, as you shut down, under stress, we regress. You're going to go down adult development levels, which means actually your capacity for empathy and your capacity to take another's perspective is going to get worse if you don't take good care of yourself, and that is your job.
But isn't some trauma worse than others?
Yes, absolutely, but it doesn't matter that their trauma is worse than yours in terms of self-care. It would be like saying I'm around starving people, I shouldn't eat, right? Your body needs food. Your mental psyche and your physiology needs care. But it's not like here, in some ways we're talking about it as if it's a limited resource, right? Like it's a zero-sum game. Like if I take care of myself, then it won't be there for that other person. When in fact, it's exponential. The more I take care of myself, the more there is in the world to take care of that person. It's almost the opposite.
Hi, thank you for doing this, first of all. Second of all, I have something that you mentioned recently sparked something in my head that I think could be good, and having a round of gratitude or having these normal conversations and making the time to connect with people. In your experience, is it beneficial to make that time mandatory? Because in my head, I'm trying to think of the journalists in our newsroom and in this building, I'm sure are going to be like, if it's voluntary, I'm not taking 15 minutes out of my day to do this. I have crap to get done. I have a story to go to shoot.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it can be seen by some of our peers, whether they believe whether it's true or not, as a waste of time to do that. Is it beneficial to make it mandatory, or should it be voluntary? Because people, I would imagine, also won't go if it's voluntary.
So first of all, you and every other profession is like, I don't need to do that. I've worked with central bankers, and they don't think they need to do it either. But it's more about weaving it into whatever the routines of your work are. So if you're running a staff meeting, then you start with a round of gratitude. It's not even mandatory. It's just now part of the meeting. This is the way we do things, right? Or I read something this week that managers need to have one meaningful conversation a week with their team members, right? Which seems like an unnecessary mandate, but engagement in the workplace they were excited that it had moved to 32%. That's terrible. If only a third of the people in your workplace feel super engaged, right? So I don't think you can make something, I haven't found making it mandatory per se, like now we will be happy. But I do believe that you can find creative ways to pull these threads through. Like I think of Trojan horses all the time. Like, we're having a meeting, and like, I'm going to ask each of you something you were proud of from last year because it happens to be January, right? And we all get to hear that of the other person, right? So trying to find ways for people to be more whole, not just the thing that's stressing them out in the moment, but there's other things about that person. And when we hear other things about that person, we're actually more patient with them when they're a jerk, or we give them more latitude, or I never thought to ask them that question because they know something about that, right? So we actually expand the connections in our workplaces.
A question on empathy, like we've heard a lot this weekend about how it can better inform our stories, and my best stories are usually when I'm leading with empathy, and you can feel that, it's palpable, but that takes more out of us. Is there a healthy level of disconnection? Can we ever disconnect in a way to self-preserve, or is that never recommended?
My recommendation isn't, I'm not recommending disconnection at all. What I recommend, and this was my training as a therapist more than anything, is that when you're listening to the story, rather than imagining that it's coming like onto you, like their story is coming into your body or your heart, I imagine it on a table between us, that their story is coming onto the table, and I'm looking at it, and we're looking at it. And when they leave, they take their story, the story belongs to them, and then I take what I got, but it doesn't infiltrate my cells. And that has been a way over these many years that I'm much more able to stay with very difficult stories without leaving feeling like I'm now carrying a 100-pound backpack.
Right here.
Yes.
Oh, I have the mic. Sorry, I have it here.
Sorry, I can't.
So I have noticed that maybe younger people in newsrooms are more open to talking about mental health than maybe some older people. And unfortunately, it's usually these older people who are in these manager positions. How can we, as maybe younger-ish people who are more open to talk about this, create a healthier environment when we're maybe not the people running the meeting or doing that sort of thing? How can we help that mental health environment?
So I'm going to turn it back to you. Have you seen anything that's worked?
In my newsroom?
Yeah.
I think it's those one-on-one conversations that you were saying. We find that there's that one manager who you feel is a little bit more of a human and a little bit more empathetic,
Yep.
who you can go to and just talk about, close the door and just, rant about whatever person, and then you open the door and you do feel a little bit better.
Yeah. I would also say to take your empathy and turn it upwards. The least empathic relationship in any organization is up the chain of command. And to imagine that the bosses have huge worries that are keeping them up at night, and you may not know what they are, but it might be interesting for you to imagine, like, what do you think is keeping he or she or they up at night, right? And then if you want to run a different conversation in your meeting, to be able to talk to that person, and I know this sounds crazy, but say, I'd like to take 5 minutes of the meeting and just have a conversation about X. Would you mind if I did that, right? To offer to do it, not imagine that they know how to do it, right? And they might be relieved, like, here, yes, please have this conversation. They might push you away, and it might be a series of conversations to get to that, right? But I also think that you can offer your interest or expertise, or even just your question. Like, you could say, we're going to pose a question to the group. What are the needs around mental health, right? What are the resources that would help us as a group? And we're just going to flip chart it, and then we'll go on with our meeting, and then maybe next week we'll look at some of those things we could do as a group, right? But just to be able to take it in small bite-sized chunks.
First of all, thank you so much for this incredible session. I had a follow-up question to the earlier topic on, I guess, like receiving the stories differently and imagining them being like almost on like a table between you. One of the things that makes it like tricky, and I think it's kind of different from therapy, is like if you have a therapy client, next week that you see them, they might have different stories. Sometimes we're talking to people about the same traumas over time, and we're sitting with their stories at a lot of different levels and applying a lot of different layers of thought to it. And if you have to actually like write about it, whether that's a script or for an article, you are actually asking for more details and sitting with those details so you can actually get it right. And that might actually happen on a story that took a few hours, but that might happen on a story that takes a couple years.
Right.
So it's like, how do you like put it on the table for 2 years? Like, you know, how do you actually, in a long-term space in that way?
So there's not one easy answer. This is the base of humanity, right? I mean, one thing that occurred to me as you were talking was that, like, to go back to some sort of version of your noble purpose and include the person you're talking to, helping them have that conversation. There's a shared like quest. I mean, I'm like going to the Lord of the Rings, which is a bad analogy, but like you're both on this quest to put put the truth out, right? For some reason that you both believe will have an impact that is positive, I believe, right? And I think that you guys are driven by it. I think maybe the conversation that's not happening is, why is it important for this other person to spend 2 years sharing their story, right? Because they're kind of risking their own like version of hell to do this, and they're doing it for a reason too, right? And I think like I was talking about the table, and what the word that came to mind when you were talking was sacred altar, or some version of, you're both coming to this sacred place, which is their story, right? And so imagining that and maybe envisioning it as a sacred place of some kind that might be a sacred place in your own mind that you know, like whether that's a church or a forest or whatever, wherever you go to imagine that. But I think that that's the container for it.
The hardest thing to do is to shut down these Q&A sessions when they could go on again for much longer. But I hope you all saw yourselves in the slides that were presented and some tools in which you can help yourselves. And I wanted to also thank Gretchen for making it happen. Thank you.